Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Vanessa Newby from Monash University in Melbourne. Do you want to do that again?
No, I think that sounded good. I've been through loud and clear, Prof. So your starter for 10 is to ask the same thing I ask of all my guests, which is to tell us what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, impeding, interesting you. What's going on for the Prof?
So what's been going on for me in the last couple of days, well, since Saturday really, is the conflict in the Middle East, the bombing of Iran, and the invasion of Lebanon by Israel, which commenced, I think, on Sunday night or Monday morning. So I'm sort of avidly watching the news to try and find out how that's going to pan out. It's difficult. I've just started teaching again, and I'm sort of trying to explain to my students, because I teach peacekeeping, and I'm sort of saying to them, well, here's the international norm, but currently that seems to have been destabilized. So it's very hard to tell them what world order looks like at the moment, because the invasion, or not the invasion, but the bombing attack, the bombing raid, I'm not quite sure exactly what we're calling it, has just sort of stepped on quite a few democratic norms with very little warning. So it's very hard to know what the world's going to look like after this. And obviously, as a scholar who has been deeply invested in the Middle East, it feels very personal, because I can picture it. I've spent time in Iran. I've spent a lot of time in Lebanon and also Syria. So for me, it makes it much more, it hits home a lot harder when you've actually spent time there.
I'm sure. And it's spreading. Hegseth just announced that NATO blew up a bomb headed for Turkey. So we've
Yeah.
seen many, many, many countries in the region affected already. Of course, Cyprus affected, and wonderful BBC and Graniad headlines about influencers who live luxurious lives in the Gulf states going through, trauma. So it is extending and very hard to know where it will go. And of course, for those in the discipline of international relations, where this notion of world order is quite crucial, at an economic level, that's been turned upside down in the last 12 months by Trump. And the administration's just announced that it's going to increase the across-the-board 10% tariff in the next few hours, which will lead to further cases before the Supreme Court. So all that Bretton Woods architecture seems imperiled. NATO's obviously imperiled. Keir Starmer's just been told that he's no Winston Churchill. Spain's just been told that there'll be no trade with the United States. I mean, we're dealing with the most violent and irresponsible country in recent world history, the United States, but in the hands of a complete lunatic. So
Yeah, there's the amount of, I mean, I don't know what I'm more shocked by, the lack of foresight as to how this would impact the globe, trade, air traffic, and the everyday, most importantly, the everyday lives of the people who are falling victim to what they call collateral damage, or the fact that, honestly, I don't even know where to begin and end. I don't know if I'm more horrified by that, or the fact that, he's prepared to go after his own allies, and sideline them. And you sort of think, he's obviously gotten very comfortable in where he is, and now feels confident after Venezuela that it's quite easy to effect regime change. But Iran is not Venezuela.
absolutely not.
Um,
And the geography is very pertinent here, including the placement of Israel, which puts a different meaning to things from anything in Latin America. The other element here, I suppose, is that fascinates me is this use of the word strike. We have struck, there's been a strike, strikes on, all this verbiage. What they mean is bombing and killing. But that term is not used very much. I don't know what it's like
Yeah,
in
I mean,
Australia, but in the United States and in Britain, it seems to be strike.
yeah, airstrikes. It sanitizes what's actually happening. And when I spoke a moment ago and I said, whatever we're calling it, because it's not a land invasion, the objectives have not been specified as usual. It just looks very much like an indiscriminate wielding of power
Yeah.
with absolutely no sense of what comes next, and now what. So it's terrifying, and it's very hard to imagine that regime change would be affected in Iran, given, if you pound a country enough, you're not going to encourage people to want to rise up and become friends with the person. I mean, of course, there's a lot of resistance in Iran to the Islamic rule as it is currently, but Iranians are still very patriotic people, and they still do not want their territory violated by an external actor. Now, in Lebanon, the situation's a little different. Things have changed on the ground. I was saying this, I've been saying this for decades, that, see, the former leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, he was very pragmatic, and he always understood, at least we could see that he always seemed to understand that he had to be very careful with Israel, because if he was seen to be dragging Lebanon directly into a conflict with Israel, then he would suffer the wrath of the Lebanese people, because a lot of them don't support Hezbollah. And so he was always very careful to sort of poke and agitate, but always sort of take the Israelis to the point where they would need to take action, and then he could say, well, I'm defending Lebanon. Yeah. And what's happened in the last few days, of course, is that now that Nasrallah is gone, he was killed in the last invasion, which was in 2024. The new leader is actually a member of the very old guard, Naim Qassem, and his actions were exactly what Nasrallah always tried not to do, which was to say, right, we're going to attack Israel because they're attacking Iran. And what has happened, in fact, has been an outright rejection of Hezbollah across Lebanon. So in some ways, that development is a positive in the long term for Lebanon if it sticks, because it will enable them to reintegrate more fully into the international community. So I'm not going to ever say that I support ad hoc invasions of any country. I'm very anti-violence, study peacekeeping for a reason. But I do hope that is a small positive outcome in this current chaos.
Now, Prof, you mentioned Trump perhaps feeling particularly comfortable after Venezuela. And that made me think about one of your key preoccupations, research areas, and interventions, which is about gender in these fields, these domains, because comfort is not a word I would normally associate with Trump. I see him as immensely anxious and neurotic. And if you look at the history of US martial masculinity, going back to the war with Spain, it's constantly to do with trying to reassert a particular kind of masculinity in the light of a fear that the essential hardness, I choose the term advisedly, of the American, I choose the word advisedly, male has been compromised by too easy a life. When JFK was elected in the months before his probably corrupt psephological triumph and his assuming the seat of president, he wrote a piece in Sports Illustrated bemoaning what he called the muscle gap, not the missile gap, but the muscle gap, because he thought that by contrast with Europe, young Americans were spending too much time watching television and sitting in cars instead of walking and taking mass transit. And that it seems to me there's a strong through line of anxiety about masculinity here. So I wondered if you might talk about that, but feeding into also the role of women in peacekeeping, in the military, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, Trump embodies a very hyper-masculine form of leadership that we also see in Putin, perhaps less overtly in Chinese authoritarianism, but it's feminist scholars would always tell you that hypermasculinity is very much linked to authoritarian and militaristic societies, where the muscled man is held up as the ideal, against which all certain attributes are matched. So loyalty, bravery, courage, and other skill sets are regarded as less important, shall we say, such as empathy and caring and understanding. So these are the aspects of humanity that get invisibilized or marginalized in environments of extreme, in military environments. And that means that when we actually get to the peace table, the emphasis is always on, oh, how can we get the combatants themselves to agree on peace? And very little time is spent understanding or trying to ameliorate the conditions of the marginalized population, which are often majority female, but not necessarily only female. Of course, there can also be other segments of society, whether that's indigenous populations or populations that are sidelined because of their sexuality or their ethnicity, or some other demarcator. So a lot of the research that looks at peacekeeping and peace studies and peace building from a feminist perspective tends to try to make visible how hypermasculine not only war but also peace is. And the fact that women are so rarely invited to the peacemaking table. So then you tend to get the same recycling of the same norms going over and over. So this is why we often, partly why, not fully why, we often don't see a great deal of societal change in terms of after conflict has been resolved.
And of course, there's a cosmic irony here, but it should come as no surprise that for centuries, much of this martial masculinity is embarked upon or incarnated in the name of the needs of femininity, the needs of women, the idea of protecting women, of saving them. If you think about the Great Game in Afghanistan and British fantasies of the 19th century, a lot of it is about saving femininity. The same with the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. On and on and on and on. Women are invoked in that particular way as in need of salvation.
Yes, there's a book by Jean Elstein. It's called The Noble Warrior. She comes up with the concept of the noble warrior and the vulnerable soul. I can't remember the exact wording. But essentially, she sort of unpacks that narrative of, the hero saving the weak and fragile female. And unfortunately, especially in the case of Afghanistan, we've actually seen a retreat back to exactly how it was before all the wars. But yes, this idea of protection runs very strong in both war and peace. And this idea that there is only a particular contribution that women make to society, which is that of being a bit Simone de Beauvoir, the lesser, the second sex, the one that cares, the one that takes care of society, the one that is empathetic. And that actually also extends into oftentimes how states conceive of women peacekeepers. They like to see them as, oh, well, you're the ones who can go in and talk to women about what they need. Rather than sort of saying, hang on a minute, maybe we're the ones who are slightly skewed towards hypermasculinity, and maybe we need to take a more holistic view of what gender actually is within the military itself. And that's very much an ongoing work in progress, because, of course, the military is and has been, as you've articulated, a bastion of hypermasculinity. So changing ideas in that institution in particular is a very long-term project, much harder than perhaps than trying to change attitudes in society at large.
Israel would be an interesting case here because it's long had compulsory military service for women. There have been lots of women in the military. But when there are spokespeople for Israel, it's the boys who are front and center, it seems to me, both as high officers in the military and as politicians. But there are women there all the time. And the same applies, for example, in the guerrilla, in many cases in Latin America, where women have often been fighters on an equal footing, but not when it comes to the hierarchy, not when it comes to being the people who speak and who make truces or break truces or whatever it might be. So I think that thing about being kept away from the table that you were talking about earlier is tremendously important, even where there is martial femininity.
Yes, absolutely. Going back to your example of Israel and Hungary actually are very interesting cases where you see a high percentage of women in the military. But in the paper I wrote with a colleague that looked at what I call gender side streaming, we identified that within NATO countries, and we included some countries in Latin America and also the Chinese military and the Israeli military, we still see this hypermasculinity. So women tend to get socialized into it if they're on the front line. But also what we tend to see in these militaries is women taking on jobs that have become feminized. So whether that's the medical services or administrative roles. So we tend to find that there's a hierarchy within militaries around which gender does the jobs. So if you want to be promoted, for example, you need to serve on the front line. But of course, until recently, until 2016, women weren't allowed to serve on the front line in the British Army. And I think it was 2013 in the US military. So, again, you're not seeing women all the way up through the system. And that's something we highlighted in that paper. So for sure, that is part of it, that, and it's not just a numbers game. And of course, there is an added burden on women who function in, militarized environments, whether it's, the police or armed forces. If you join an institution and you're the odd person out, do you really want to be the one always calling that out? No, you want to fit in, you want to be accepted because you have your own personal goals. And in the military in particular, that's very much about fitting in with your battalion, with your immediate circuit. So we're also the big challenge of trying to make something like a military more gender equal is also the fact that the people that we might ordinarily expect to help, I don't want to say, make it more gender equal, tend to actually be the ones who just want to, pretend that there isn't a difference. So it's very, very difficult.
And of course, in Britain and in the United States, there are lots of instances of sexual assault in mixed sex battalions and so on, appalling stories. And as so often with sexual violence, one senses that this is the tip of the proverbial, right? Because so many people, as you say, just want to fit in, and with good reason, in terms of A, their careers, but B, their own safety, right? I mean,
that's right.
You and your colleague refer to a UN resolution from 2000 to this effect of trying to make the military more equal, right? And how has that played out in the UN's own hands in terms of peacekeeping forces, in places like Lebanon and others?
So Resolution 1325, which was what's the word? Unilaterally accepted, or bilaterally or multilateral. It was accepted on October 31, 2000, aimed to improve the condition of women and the involvement of women in a number of facets of international peace and security. So it came off the back of the Beijing platform of 1995, the Beijing Women's Conference. And there are a number of areas or pillars that are involved. So it's not just peacekeeping, it's also peace building. So over time, that resolution developed what we call the four pillars of WPS, which is women, peace, and security, which is prevention, protection, participation, and relief and recovery, with the idea that there would be prevention of violence against women in war, protection of women in war, participation of women in war and peace, and participation of women in the recovery phase after conflict. But what we tended to see early on in the follow-up resolutions and the focus of the United Nations initially was very much a focus on protection and prevention. So again, sort of recycling the idea that you mentioned earlier of the fact that women are there to be protected. They're not protagonists in their own right. But then there was a bit of the feminist world continued to flag that up. And by 2015, the UN was sort of saying, look, we need more participation. But participation in that form tends to be viewed by the UN fairly simplistically, which means let's add more women to peacekeeping. And there was a wonderful paper by Dharma Puri in 2011. I think she coined the phrase, just add women and stir, suggesting that that's all you need. And as I've just said, unfortunately, changing an institution goes beyond adding 30% of women, which is usually the UN target. In Lebanon, we do see actually quite a high number. We did see at least quite a high number of women peacekeepers in UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. But that's partly because at the time, I would say it was regarded as one of the safer missions. Of course, that's all changed now. That changed in 2023 after the horrific attacks in Israel, Palestine. And then the mission became more dangerous because that's when Hezbollah started launching more missiles back into Israel. The UN has done its best to activate that resolution, but unfortunately, again, the rise in authoritarianism, what we're tending to see now is a decrease in interest in women's inclusion, and again, this comes off the back of this kind of very hyper masculine type of leadership that we didn't used to see. And so ironically, I'm about to publish a book about women, peace and security agenda in the Middle East. So looking exactly on the ground, how that has been interpreted, because 7 states in the Middle East have adopted the WPS agenda, as we call it. But what happened since we wrote the book is that I feel that whenever a war actually occurs or strikes occur, we tend to see less emphasis again on women. So, if we look at Ukraine, there was a lot of work on Ukrainian women soldiers, but then when the war occurred, it was sort of like, but we don't have time to focus on that. We've got to focus on the real business of war, and that means sidelining issues like gender. So I suspect again, during this current conflict, if we can call it that, because it's just escalating out of control, or very close to being out of control, I would say. We also again will probably see a retreat from initiatives. It seems to me that when there is peace, people start talking about the need to include women, at least at the academic and some policymakers. But as soon as the circumstances change, it all seems to be forgotten again.
Of course, again, in the US instance, there has been a rolling back of opportunities for women and minorities in the US military as a consequence of the white supremacist masculinity that's been running the Pentagon, signified both in the brutish, idiotic presence of Hegseth, but also in the renaming of the Department of Defense as the Department of War. Although in a kind of Orwellian spirit, I concur that might be a more honest,
more accurate
use of nomenclature. You've got a couple of books coming out, I think one this, one next, that I read about. Could you take us through those books a bit, to the extent that you feel you can release information to the public at this stage?
Of course. I think probably maybe I should say that one of the things about me that as a scholar is that I'm most interested in is the minutiae of how things work on the ground.
Mm.
So when people sort of say the UN intervened or diplomacy happened, I always want to know how that happened, who spoke to whom, what was said, who was in the room, and so forth. And so this curiosity has sort of pushed me towards looking at the nitty-gritty of how politics happens on the ground. Partly why I spent a great deal of time in the Middle East, because I wanted to see it for myself. I spent a lot of time learning Arabic in order to be able to talk to the local population in the wider Middle East. So one of the books I've got coming out, as I mentioned, is an edited volume with my colleague Bilge Sahin. She's at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. And we're, again, looking at how the women, peace and security agenda is being localized in the Middle East. So the question there is not whether or not the agenda exists, because, you know, they've adopted national action plans, but how it gets translated and interpreted in local political contexts. So that should be coming out hopefully around June this year. And we cover quite a number of states, the UAE, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq. We have a chapter on Iran, Morocco, Tunisia. So we have chapters on each of the countries, and then we have sort of wider chapters that look at how the WPS agenda might be developed in the Middle East. So it's called Imagining the WPS Agenda in the MENA region, to try and take it beyond the sort of empirics. And then the second, more broadly, the second contribution that I would say that I sort of made to peacekeeping is with my colleague Chiara Ruffa, who is a professor at Sciences Po. And we are together co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Peacekeeping as Social Practice. And I'm very much a practice relational scholar myself. But this volume collects work that has accumulated over the last 20, 25 years that hasn't really necessarily been acknowledged as a genre within the peacekeeping literature. So we've identified a large number of scholars who, I'm happy to say, have all responded very enthusiastically to being part of the handbook, because they also agree that we haven't really defined the field. So this is hopefully a field-defining book that looks at the everyday practice of peacekeeping missions on the ground. So what I call the meso level. So it doesn't examine necessarily the local population so much as how the mission operates in the local context. So that's what's coming out in 2027. And as you can imagine, with I think 45 chapters, that's going to be quite a bit of work.
And a doorstopper, as the saying goes, I guess a digital doorstopper nowadays. This brings me to the wider question of international relations as an academic endeavor, as a discipline or a sub-discipline of political science, or whatever one calls it, which has been historically, I think it's fair to say, pretty male-dominated, very male-dominated. So I'm interested in A, the way women have made their way into and redefined that field, but B, the way in which men have taken up those challenges, those new ideas, or haven't. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot. The field's changed so much. I mean, when I first entered it, I would say that I was definitely very much on the fringes in what I was interested in looking at. So, you know, when I started to study it, so my first degree was in psychology, and then I moved over to international relations. Because I love travel and I loved sort of global and events and politics. So it seemed I couldn't find an area that I wanted to specialize in psychology. I sort of wanted to do something to do with the world. And when I joined the discipline in the mid 2000s to do my master's, I found, lots of armchair theorizing by white old men telling us how the world worked. And what I immediately saw was what seemed to me to be a complete lack of interest in the minutiae, in the meso level, in relationships and how things actually worked. But that has changed as more and more women have come to the discipline. So I would say, I mean, it's still predominantly white, which is a problem. The global south is not represented well yet in our discipline. There are attempts, but again, unfortunately, the norms of publishing, as you know, academic publishing often can be very exclusionary, especially around access to materials. I mean, AI is helping a bit with language, at least. So it's an equalizing people who aren't, because it's very Anglo-dominated sphere as well. And obviously, feminist scholarship has increased, I mean, more than tenfold. But again, I mean, the tricky bit as well is to make sure that we don't equate more women joining the field with, oh, more women talking about women, because and that's another challenge. Often when I first started working in the field, people would say to me, "Oh, great, you're a woman, so can you look at women peacekeepers?" And I sort of thought, well, what if I'm not interested in that? And actually, although I do write on gender and WPS now, I've actually never written anything specifically about women peacekeepers, not because I'm not, apart from sort of incidentally in that article I mentioned, because I think gender is really important, but I also enjoy applying other theory or theoretical approaches to my work that don't always just essentialize that distinction. But having said that, as a self-identifying feminist, I will usually find a way to critique from that perspective.
One of the elements of strategic essentialism in areas like environmental studies and violence is to argue that women are so involved in caring for others, so involved in nurturance, so involved in familial responsibilities, that they are in some sense less violent than men. And of course, in terms of the amount of violence in the world, I don't think anybody would doubt that empirically. But there is also this notion of there being something in the essence of gender that makes men more violent than women, and that is almost inexorable, although not necessarily universal. One runs into those arguments a lot. For example, here in Latin America, one of the big issues is a lot of, and this is obviously a big generality, but there's a fair bit of research to back it up, lots of women giving very little freedom of action or thought to their daughters and a lot to their sons, on the grounds that men are basically children. They never grow up. They'll always be irresponsible. They'll always do terrible things. And women must try to keep them in check and must themselves, therefore, constantly be in check.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when I think about what we might call Eastern feminism, which is sort of, in Iran in particular, there is a version of Eastern feminism. Or Islamic feminism, there's a similar mentality where it's the idea that women, we have to assume that men will do bad things, and therefore women need to accept that and find a way to, prevent it from happening as much as possible through various behaviors. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's that lack of imagination to think that we live in a world where things are so predetermined. Now, okay, biologically, testosterone has a lot to answer for sure. When I was studying psychology, I think they said if you locked up every young man from about the age of 15 to 35, which is when testosterone is at its height, there would be something like an estimated 84% reduction in crime, in violent crime. So for sure, testosterone has a role to play, but it's very much, isn't it, about it goes back to the noble warrior, beautiful souls. That was a counterpoint for Elstein's work. Noble warrior, beautiful souls dynamic, where we just tend to think that, men are inherently violent and there's nothing we can do to change that, rather than, okay, how as a society can we restructure and how can we raise men and women to see the world in more gender equal terms, rather than making these sort of deterministic assumptions about their capacity for violence. And we see that playing out a lot, as I said, in the peace building field, where women will be invited because of the perception that they understand, peace better than men, which of course is and then when war comes, there's the alternate assumption that men understand that better than women, and therefore women need to be excluded again. But because the hierarchy of war globally tends to be higher than the hierarchy of peace, this is why we tend to see, hierarchies remaining in place rather than, you think if we all really wanted peace, and women are really good at it, why don't we see more women in charge? But that's not how it works, because fundamentally we still place conflict hierarchically above that of peace.
And also that being a key role of the state. And there's a problem, I think, with assuming there's a direct correlation between the possibility that there'd be a vast decrease in criminal violence if those guys were put away somewhere. And
I'm not advocating for that, by the way, just to be clear.
I understand. And the role of the state. Because, I mean, first of all, of course, if the young men were locked up, they'd kill one another. So the rate of violence would, in fact, not necessarily decrease at all.
That's a good
just
point.
Be shifted into prisons. But the idea that that then explains the function of the state, I think, is quite problematic, because there are so many elements at play: corporate interests, media interests, military interests, diplomatic interests, which may well be dominated by men, but are not necessarily driven by testosterone. They're driven by material interest in many, many cases, in ways that can either be in sync or can be in conflict. No?
Yes, but who defines what interests we have?
Well, I mean, increasingly, obviously, the attempt to be somewhat more transparent about who's in these elites discloses a heck of a lot of men. But there are more women than ever before in elite corporate positions in places like the United States. And it is not clear to me that they are driven by different forces from the ones that drive men.
Because, as I said, women, when you're a minority, you tend to get socialized into the norms of the institution.
Yeah.
So there was this theory, Elizabeth Cantor, she came up with the idea, the concept through her own research, which was, if you have 30% women or more in an institution, you will automatically, and by that I can also mean a corporation or any kind of organization, you will automatically see a more feminine perspective and a more feminist perspective. And ultimately, research now has sort of agrees that that's just not the case, because we are 50% of the population, but also when you grow up, I mean, it just in ordinary life, you are often socialized into, as a woman, as you mentioned, Latin American case, but even in Northern Europe, where I grew up, you have this idea that there are certain norms and traits. You've got to be good. You've got to be good if you're a girl. You've got to be nice. Whereas a man is said, no, you've got to be authoritative. And of course, that has backlash on both genders. Everybody loses without gender equality. It's not as if men get this automatic benefit. They might in some arenas, but they also lose the ability to really embrace empathy and caring themselves. So I mean, everybody loses and suffers as a result. So the idea, in my perspective, is we need to be more imaginative in how we conceive of a gender equal world, instead of sort of sticking a band-aid over a few sort of technical problems, like, oh, well, if we just see a few more women peacekeepers or a few more women at the peace table. Well, women can sit at the peace table, but if they're being silenced and seen as a nuisance or a spoiler, they're not going to be heard. So it's tokenism.
Shifting the terrain for a moment, Prof, I wanted to ask you about teaching. So you studied, researched, taught, done field work in different contexts: Northern Europe, Britain, the Netherlands, the Middle East, and now Australia. When you're talking about these issues, do you see a difference in between those places of the world, parts of the world, amongst student interest, receptiveness, resistance, knowledge? I mean, do children in Australia just not know very much about the rest of the world compared to, sorry, I shouldn't say children, but young adults in Australia not know much compared to, say, in the Netherlands or in Lebanon?
Um, I think geography plays a role with Australia because what you tend to find in Australia is that, unlike, so in the UK, for example, you would tend to go for your year off, your gap year, right? After A levels. So at 18, 19, you'd go often, funnily enough, to Australia, but nowadays they're a bit more adventurous and they go all over the place. I mean, my gap year was spent in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia, not in Australia. Um, but in Australia, what you tend to find is people go to university and then will say, okay, now I'm ready to travel to usually to Europe because they want to go and live and work there. And so I was always struck when I lived in London as a much younger woman when I met Australians how unworldly they were because they just had never. So they were highly educated, but very unworldly, which in Europe they tend to go hand in hand. If you're highly educated, you tend to be quite aware of global events. So I would say there is that difference. But in the Middle East, I mean, I think these are societies that are deeply political. Political discourse is part of everyday life. You take your chair and you take your coffee, your ahwe, and you will go and sit on the street and maybe smoke 5 or 6 cigarettes and discuss the affairs of the day. And politics will always come into it all over the Middle East. So I would say that, I mean, when you find people in the Middle East who really reject politics, it's either a specific sort of strata of the population, or it's people who are actively trying to just pretend it doesn't exist because it's too stressful to think about it
It's
deeply.
just too painful.
Too painful, absolutely. So you do get a bit of that. But I would say in any student, I mean, obviously I'm biased because my students are international relations scholars. So of course they have an inherent interest already in understanding foreign affairs. But I wouldn't say students in the Netherlands were terribly different to students in Australia. I'd say their knowledge of the world was probably pretty similar from the get-go, from the beginning. Maybe a little bit more worldly. But again, I think that's more a function just of geography.
And I'm assuming in the Netherlands also there would be a greater interest in the former Dutch Empire in terms of it being a world center for studying East Asia.
Not so much anymore, actually, I would say. When I was teaching there, the interest in the Middle East was particularly high. The Dutch actually have a very strong and very generous presence, actually, in parts of the Middle East. They do focus quite heavily, especially in Lebanon. They were there and they were trying to help a lot. There is a national rhetoric that definitely kind of emphasizes Indonesia and the role the Netherlands played. But I wouldn't say at student level that I noticed a particular bent towards that, which I think you're right. It's surprising. It just shows, they've probably outgrown that history.
Well, it is none of them, not even their parents were alive during the war with Indonesia after the War of Independence after the Second World War. Interesting. So I had one more question for you, if I may, Prof. And once you've answered that, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you might wish, and that could take the form of something entirely new that we've not touched on, or retracing terrain we've partially covered where you want to say something more. Does that make sense as a means of bringing things to a close?
Certainly. And now I'm racking my brain, so I have to be very careful. I have a touch of, I don't know if it's ADHD. I haven't been diagnosed, but I'm just going to focus on what you're saying because otherwise my brain will start thinking about, oh, is there anything else I wanted to add? So let's take it one step at a time.
You bet. So my last question is about hope. We're in a moment now in terms of what's going on in good grief, the UAE, Kuwait, Cyprus, Turkey, Iran, Lebanon. We just listed them. Straits of Hormuz, etc.
Jordan.
It's very hard to have hope at the moment, I think. Do you have any, and what's the wellspring of it?
Oh, that's a really good question. I am a relentless optimist. So I would like to say that somewhere within me, there will always be hope. It's funny, I was asking the students yesterday that I was teaching about the UN and asking them why peacekeeping exists, from their perspective. And it was really touching how many of them said, yeah, but this has to be the only way. We have to build peace. Peacekeeping is the best thing. And I said, I really love your optimism. It's very nice to hear, especially, I mean, it must be very frightening for their generation, because I grew up in the very spoiled situation of being born in the 70s where, okay, the UK was very poor, but then we had the 80s and, everywhere it was glasnost, it was perestroika, the Cold War came to the end. So it was an incredibly optimistic time. So maybe I'm just a prodigy of that optimism. But I like to think that even if there is great pain and suffering, which there is right now, I still believe that humanity will be able to overcome it somehow. But it will, I suspect, very rarely look like what we expect it to look. And I don't know where that saving is going to come from. I don't know how we're going to save ourselves. Let's put it that way.
Wow. So there's hope in what you said, but there's an element of despair, which is probably the thing that's picking at my brain more right now. And then lastly, anything you'd like to add? Could be something that's about a topic we haven't discussed, could be something that's about a theme that we did mention.
I'm still annoyed that I can't remember. I had a second point to make about Trump, and it's completely escaped me. But that's age, I'm afraid. Is there anything else I would like to say? I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Um, Gosh, I'd like to say something deeply profound. But no, I'm afraid there isn't any final note. But if you have any questions that you feel I haven't answered fully from what we talked about, I'm very happy to
No, you've been
expand.
great. And I'm going to provide a link to your excellent website, which in itself gives anybody who wants to visit the opportunity to learn a lot about many of these topics. It's a really terrific guide and resource. So thank you for making that happen. And thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you, Toby. It's been great to meet you.